All right. Good morning, everybody. Yesterday, as you remember, I gave a talk about depression treatment. It was a bit dry, because I didn't talk about mechanisms or much of theory, but looked at data. So I'm going to try to do something slightly different today and talk about something that many of you may not have necessarily thought about. I hope you will engage and you will ask questions as you did yesterday and be critical towards what I say. So I was asked to talk about emotion dysregulation, and I'm going to focus on one aspect of emotion dysregulation, which is what we call irritability and anger, because I think this is particularly salient to clinicians, and it's of great interest more generally, as I'm hoping to show you this morning. So this is the outline of my talk. I'm going to give some basic introduction to irritability and anger, then I'm going to talk about it as a clinical problem, assessment and measurement, and then treatment. So I'm going to start with some basic remarks, and of course you got to start with something historical and say that that anger and wrath is at the root of our written, at least, civilization. For those of you who know, the first word of the Iliad, one of the oldest texts available to us, starts with the word rage. And it's about a self-destructive rage, that of Achilles, that brought upon very many bad things unto his own people and himself, for those of you who remember. Then you have fierce anger in the Bible. So it's not just humans who can be angry, but the Lord himself, bringing anger to bear on the people and destroying, ruining the lands and the people. There's anger as an interpersonal problem. This is from the London Tube. Don't take it out on our staff. Don't have rages against our staff. And, there's this thing about social anger. Anger about taxation, anger about inflation, all sorts of things. Anger is mounting. You'll see that very often in the papers. So it's anger and this idea that there's going to be some sort of emotion dysregulation, people will lose it, is very common, and it's omnipresent, in fact. And it's a particular concern now in schools and other places about how people are going to respond. I alluded to it yesterday, and I'm very happy to talk more about it later, but I just want to remark here that implicitly we all have rules and expectations about other people's behavior. If I start lashing out right now, you will judge me, and probably quite rightly so. But this is because we have as a society some kind of rules, rough rules about how people should behave. And these, of course, vary from country to country, time to time, even city to city. And our tolerance of it. I don't seem to be able to move my slides. Should I say next, please? Next, please. Oh, here we go. So anyway, this is, very luminous writers talked about this. Aristotle, interestingly, talked about anger in his Art of Rhetoric, and this is important because anger was for him, and for many, something social, something about how you interact. Emotions were all about how you interact with others. And if you wanted to be successful, for example, as a politician at the time, you had to master emotions, your own, but particularly the manipulation of the emotions of others. So it was in his rhetoric rather than in his metaphysics. This has very important implications about how we think about emotions. Most of modern neuroscience is about how you as an individual kind of process emotions. But for many other disciplines and many of the, as I said, luminous authors, it's about how you interact. Yes. Oh, good, yeah. It would be wrong not to mention, Seneca's great work. I think I'm stuck again, sorry. So this is an instance of the frustration hypothesis. No, seriously, this is how we design experiments with young people when we want to frustrate them in an experimental setting. The joystick doesn't work.
How do you know we didn't set it up?
Yeah, exactly, so that I lose it and it becomes a performance. Just get up and go. Yeah, okay, great, thanks. So, but I wanted to talk to you briefly about the Sicilian Vespers. Do people know what that is? That's a very important event in history, right? And you know about the Vespers. That's how you spot the Catholics here who know about the Vespers. But it was in, I think, Marta, I say all this with due respect and fear, 1282, I believe, when on the night leading to Easter Monday, right, there was an insurgency, an uprising in Sicily that became, in Palermo in particular, and it was directed against Charles II, is that right? And what happened, apparently, was that someone affected with their behavior the honor of Sicilian women. And if you know about Italy, and Greece for that matter, at least up until some time ago, it is a sin even to say, how is your mother or how is your wife, let alone do something as some Frenchmen did at the time. Apparently that was the reason. So there was a huge insurgency and there was blood spilled. And apparently what happened was they said to people, the streets were filled with angry, armed men crying death to the French, right? And the way they could figure out that they were French was apparently because they couldn't pronounce the word that I will probably... Is it Ciciri? Yes. Okay. So they couldn't pronounce it, and so they knew how to slay them. And many, many Frenchmen were slain on that night. So there was a lot of anger. And then what happened, and this is a very crucial bit, there was anger, and then at the end, the French had given up to the Sicilians not only their ill-gotten riches, but their lives as well. The historian of the time tells us. So there was a liberation. So if you take a step back now and you look at it historically, or you look at it anthropologically, the interest here is that, of course, there's a bigger context. It wasn't just that someone did something to the honor of people there. That may have been something that happened there, of course, and it may have been important, but there was a big historical context during which the Byzantines had an interest in undermining Charles II. Charles II was using Sicily and exploiting it. There was all sorts of things going on. But I'm leaving that out now, and I'm just telling you the following thing. It is an act of anger that leads to what at the end? A reward, right? So, yes, yep, well, here you go. Leads to a reward. It leads to a victory. Right? We'll come back to that because it is clinically important that you do something, you have an emotion, and the emotion has a currency. The emotion and the acts that may flow out of it have a currency in the world that you inhabit because we're social beings. Okay, so I'm going to leave the Sicilian Vespers for a moment. Sorry. Next, please. So just a simple definition of irritability is that it refers to inter-individual differences in proneness to anger, and those may reach a pathological extent. It's one of the major modes of stress response, right? And it's a potent modifier of the environment, which we often don't think about, right? One of the functions of anger is supposed to be a response to threat. So what determines the extent of anger to a threatening stimulus, and what else happens in the environment? Let's look at that for a bit. Typically, as I said, the current theory about anger is the one about frustration, right? So it's what happened to me right now, and what I do with children who I want to, engage in an experiment is, the joystick stopped working, and it can be very effective to the point that you may have to stop an experiment because people may start kind of smashing things, right? So this is the typical thing. So it's a blocked goal attainment. You wanted to do something, you wanted to press that button, and you can't. Okay, this is the standard theory, and it is very interesting, and it has been very successful in explaining a number of phenomena, and we use it. But there's another very interesting story, which is, suppose you have a threat. Someone is threatening you. Someone is coming upon you and threatens you to do something to you. Well, we know about fight and flight responses. Let's just think about those two just to make it easier. What would determine, this has been a question that I've been asking myself for a very long time, what would determine whether you would respond with fear or with anger? I was thinking this when I was a young man, or even a young boy, and I was reading about big battles. And as you do, you think, would I be as brave as blah blah? You know, would I do this? And I was trying to think about, well, how could I predict that? What would be the determinants of it? You know, what would influence my behavior in that instance? Now, people would say, well, there's inter-individual differences in, you know, anger or risk-taking, for that matter. And that may be true. So inter-individual differences, how we all vary in our propensity for anger and all that, may play a role. But then I thought, well, what about what happens within an individual? Because sometimes you can be brave, sometimes not, right? Just folk psychologically. So we designed an experiment for that. And we thought, if you have a threat, one and the same threat, and you're obviously one and the same person, what would make a difference in terms of how you would respond? So you have threats, and you could respond with anger or fear or whatever else. And we thought about one thing called environmental affordances. So what is available to you in the environment when you're under threat? So we designed an experiment of the following type. We created something like a threat. Obviously, ethically, you can't go there and threaten people and, you know, bully your subjects. But what you can do is present them with, you know, potential threats, like, I don't know, zombies coming out of a video clip or something like that, right? And then you tell them, okay, these zombies are coming upon you, and you could either fight or you could escape. If you decide to fight, you have a weapon available, something you could, you know, ward off the zombies or whatever it is that is attacking you, or you have a pen available to you, right? Or something like that, right? Another implement. So let's just use that. So then we asked them, okay, would you fight or would you escape? And then how fearful are you and how angry are you? Now, as you might expect, if you have a threat, right, and one and the same person is presented with the same threat stimulus, when they have a weapon, they're more likely to tell you, well, I'll fight. Right? That's pretty trivial, right? And they will, you know, escape. They will choose to escape if they, you know, had the pen. So that kind of makes sense. But the other interesting thing is that when they have, these are anger ratings here. This is the percentage of fighting choice, and you can see that when they have a weapon, they are more likely to fight than when they don't have a weapon. But what happens when they have a weapon is also that they're much more likely to report that they're angry. Does that make sense? So the environmental affordance, right, if you can afford to fight, you're more likely to be angry. We showed the opposite for fear. When you have an escape route, you're much more likely to be fearful. So environmental affordances, what is available to you to do in the environment, seems to shape quite a bit. We explained about 30% of the variance of the intra-individual response, of the ratings, the emotional ratings. So this suggests that it's not just the stimulus that determines whether you'll be angry or not. So it's not just the French taxation and rule, but it is whether you know that you've organized the weapons, you have the logistics ready, and others to help you do your uprising, and then you will deploy your anger. So an important thing to remember here is that people deploy emotions, it seems, for certain situations. Now, I'm not saying that you sit there and say, okay, which emotion am I going to deploy right now, anger or fear? But it happens probably pretty automatically. So our experiments show it in this context. There are other experiments that show similar things. So, for example, if you have to enter an interpersonal context, conflict, and people say, okay, what would you choose? They choose music, right, that would, or video clips that would induce anger before the interpersonal conflict, just to prepare them, it seems, for that thing. So we choose our emotions, sometimes, not always. As I said, there are emotions like love that may strike you, in a way that you don't expect. Okay, so just remember that, because this has some clinical relevance, as I will show you later on, I hope. This is another way of showing this. This is what I just told you. So I'm going to just skip over this. So we were then interested in what happens when you have nothing to do. Like people say, okay, there's a stimulus, it's blocked, but have you ever felt angry when you were just sitting there? Do you know this feeling? There's some no? Some people no? Okay, maybe it's just me. There's some fantastic descriptions in Dostoevsky of emotions, of mood states that you just have, it seems, right? Out of nowhere. Some people may be better aware about their own emotions and be able to ascribe it to a reason. But some people, like myself, don't know. I just sit there and, well, let's go to it. How could it happen? What happens when we have nothing to do? So we did an experiment, and this was in the back of some experiments we did in the computational neuroscience work that we do, where we developed a model of mood, which I'm not talking about here in much detail, but we developed a model of mood, which had to do with stimuli and rewards and all that. And then we thought, okay, well, what if there's nothing on the screen? Right? What if instead of rewards and punishers, I just show you a cross? For those of you who do functional imaging, you will know, or even just experimental psychology, you will know that crosses like these occur in interstimulus intervals, right? Just between stimuli. Plus, it's what you stare at, what you're asked to stare at during so-called resting state experiments, right? Does anyone do resting state MRI? Yeah, right. You sit there and just look at the cross, right? And that's supposed to be a neutral condition, right? A resting state. So we said, well, what happens when you do this? And we asked people to rate their emotions whilst looking at that, right? And what we found very consistently was this, that over time, people's mood tends to drop. People become more and more frustrated as they are sitting there staring at a cross. Important, and we were able, I mean, this is my most replicated finding ever. I think we've had something like 16,000 people we did it in, literally various different cohorts, because we couldn't quite, believe it. And then we also saw that it works in other contexts, such as you could, if you had people play a gambling task, say that is sufficiently kind of annoying or boring, again, people get, over time, people's mood drift. So we described this phenomenon as mood drift over time. Initially, I had called it passage of time dysphoria, but people thought this was sounded too lofty, and so they said, no, mood drift over time is better. So people's mood drops as they do this. This has quite some important methodological implications, because if you're doing resting state imaging, and there is intra-individual variability in how your mood behaves, drawing inferences about mood states during resting state has its difficulties, as you might imagine. Importantly, for those of you who are interested in psychometrics, this phenomenon is highly reproducible. So you will get it, I venture to say, guarantee you that you would get it in every cohort that you would test. But if you look at the stability as measured by the ICC, so a measure of correlation, so whether the same individual will be consistent over time, it isn't very high. It's about, the ICC is about 0.5, which means that there's a lot of state variability to it. So you can't easily predict it. So therefore, it could mess up your experiment quite badly, depending on the inferences you're going to draw. That's the methodological bit. But the interesting substantive bit is that this phenomenon happens, and it seems to happen more in people who are more sensitive to rewards. Right? If you're more sensitive to rewards, you're much more likely to become annoyed by just sitting there.
I was wondering about the changes in the same individual over time. Yeah. How much age plays a role?
Yeah. Thank you. So I was expecting that it would be more pronounced in adolescence, and we looked at this, and it wasn't actually. And I think we had enough power to look at the moderation effect. But I'm going to go back to it because I can't quite believe it, to be honest. I would have thought that it would be much more pronounced there. But no, we haven't found it. And we did span an age range from 14 to whatever, 50 or something like that. So, but I'll go back to it with new data that we're collecting now. But the interesting thing is, as I said, we took a reward sensitivity parameter from our computational models, right? How much you're likely to respond to rewards, different rewards, and we saw that the more likely you are to respond to rewards, the more likely you are to experience this passage of time dysphoria, or this mood drift, right? This to us suggests that there is that when you think you're just sitting there, you have a representation not just of the actual world, but of what I would call opportunity cost. What could I be doing that would be much nicer than sitting here in Argyris Stringaris' lecture on a Tuesday morning? You see what I mean? So it would be a very, you represent the alternative. And this is a very important property that humans have, right? Economists use the term opportunity cost. For what things, if you do this activity, you could be making more money or less money with another activity, right? Here it is about the representation of an alternative possibility, right? So people who have a high sense of the alternative, I could be making a lot of money, or I could be having a lot of fun otherwise, right, are more likely to experience this phenomenon. So just remember that, again, I think it has some clinical relevance, as I hope I will show. This is a new model that we're testing. About opportunity cost and the mood drift over time. I shan't bother you with that. I said something else, which again is a prequel to what I'm going to be saying clinically, which is our moods interact with the world, right? So I'm going to try this out on you. If I go like, or something like that, right? I mean, it looks a bit silly, but you know what I mean. You'll be thinking, what? Because it's a different emotion to what you expect, right? So this. If you think about it, there is a threshold. There are some norms that you impose on the behavior of others, that we impose on each other. I operate within those expectations, and it is very clear that I throw emotions at you at a certain rate. But at the moment, it's the emotions you expect, right? But I could violate those expectations. And as I said, there might be a reason why I want to violate your expectations. We know that children's tantrums influence parental responses. Anyone who has observed a child when they want to play a video game and their parent says it's bedtime will have heard about this. There's things like gene-environment correlations, which are very interesting, right? How the environment of a child responds to a child by virtue of genetically shaped behaviors of the child, right? This is, for example, with ADHD, I was talking about it yesterday, your quite likely genetically shaped behavior may elicit responses from your environment that could be, for example, depressogenic. There are other things like accommodation, for example, parental accommodation in OCD or spousal accommodation in OCD. I'm washing my hands 30 times a day, and and my wife brings me the towel, and I think, thank you, darling. And if she says one day, no, I'm not bringing it out, what am I going to do? Lash out. Lash out. Hopefully not, but do you know what I mean? So behave in a way that will coerce my environment. This has, and people will ask me about evolution yesterday, and this is an interesting example. This is a study that was done in the 80s in Africa amongst the Maasai, and it was a natural experiment in the sense that people had gone there and collected temperament data before a big famine, right? They didn't know the famine was coming, right? But they collected the data, and then the famine sadly happened, and then they went back. It seemed like the more difficult children were more likely to survive, if you see what I mean. Difficult children, the more irritable children, the children who are more likely to kind of cry, shout, da-da-da. Why would that be? Well, we don't know for sure, but one possible explanation for that is that if you're able to be demanding, right, you might get more resources. So remember always that we live in groups, and the evolutionary pressures that we have lead to variability in our traits, right, in how we are from an evolutionary point of view. In certain environments, it's advantageous for the individual or for the group that is under selective pressure to display some behaviors that under other circumstances might not be good, right? If I can rush into battle, I might be very good for particular environments. If I could be angry under such circumstances, it may be very good, but it could be very bad if I have to sit exams in school or something like that. Does that make sense? Okay. So with that in mind, think about what we call, before we enter the clinical bit, and I'm going to come back to the scheme, about parent-child coercive cycles now. So a child makes a demand, a parent refuses, child throws a tantrum, the parent gives in, child quietens down. What happens there? Behaviorists will have, behaviorists will talk to you about what? What do we call this? It's a reinforcement. It's a very simple reinforcement cycle. But who gets reinforced? So suppose the parent eventually gives in. What is being reinforced here? Sorry? Yeah, exactly. Increasing the probability of the behavior of the child. But also, the fact that the child then, quietens down reinforces the behavior of the parent. Does that make sense? Okay. So there's a mutual reinforcement. And what we're trying to do right now is to look at multi-agent reinforcement learning. So you can fit a reinforcement learning, a standard Rescorla-Wagner reinforcement learning model to this, right? But you can also do some fancier things now, where the model is non-stationary in the sense that what you do has an effect on the other, and the effect on the other has an effect back on you. So it becomes very interesting. But this is a very clinical phenomenon, and the efficacious treatments for excessive tantrums operate, or are thought to operate, at the level of the reinforcement learning. Okay, so and now we're entering the clinical world. Okay. Okay.
Could I just ask you?
Of course.
No, don't worry. It's not something relevant to. The people online were saying that sometimes the voice gets a bit low. If you
sorry. I'm sorry.
I know you do that to test the frustration.
No, okay. I'll
I
keep.
know it's difficult, but
Yeah, I'm fidgety. You see, I need my methylphenidate. No, so emotion dysregulation, and irritability as a clinical problem. So I'm going to read this out to you. Jack's a 9-year-old boy with ADHD and some specific learning difficulties, dyslexia, say. Mother says, and notice the language, he can be a nightmare, paces around all the time, gets into fights with his brother, he shouts back at his mother, known to be grumpy, especially on school days, gets picked on by other pupils, get into fights, excluded from school. Even a slight remark by the brother is enough to make him very angry. If you ask him, he says, yeah, I'm naughty. I'm naughty. So, that sort of thing. And now his ADHD improved considerably on methylphenidate, right? Got better, as did the anger, right? Mum said, oh, I actually used some other interventions, like, I talked to school about bullying, but I also, a reward chart was actually very helpful. So this is the intervention I'll talk to you about, part of the intervention we'll talk about in a minute. You will see similar things, but sometimes more excessive in autism, right? And those of you who worked in autism with, core autism with learning difficulties may have seen temper tantrums that lasted for 3 or 4 hours. It's quite extraordinary, particularly if you've ever done home visits or asked parents to bring you videos. You'll see something which is like a catatonic state, except it is in anger. It's pretty spectacular. I have worried occasionally that there might be rhabdomyolysis after that people may have, the kind of, their muscles might be affected by the degree of tension and everything after that. So it's quite extraordinary. Again, these things can happen in those instances because of small changes, right, which is kind of the frustration hypothesis, right, or the expectation violation hypothesis. I was expecting you to take me to my grandmother's this weekend, and all of a sudden you're saying that, we're not going anywhere, or we're going to some other new place where I'm also expected to socialize. Well, that's very hard, right? So these things happen there. Now, some terminological things that might be of interest here. The term emotion dysregulation is very broad. It encompasses pretty much every phenomenon that we encounter in psychiatry. Well, not in the whole psychiatry, but in a lot of psychiatry. Like, you're emotionally dysregulated, perhaps if you're depressed, or if you're anxious, or if everything, right? The interesting thing is irritability sits between the negative valence and the positive valence. So the valence is negative, obviously, but it is an approach emotion, right? Usually negative emotions are avoidance emotions. If you're anxious or depressed, you will avoid situations. With irritability, you will approach it, you will go there and have a fight, and things like that, all right? So it's quite interesting. So when people talk about emotion dysregulation, try to figure out what they mean. I'm focusing on this bit here just because the rest of the stuff you heard about yesterday and you'll hear from others as well. People have different names. You don't need to read the small print here, but people talk about anger, rage, frustration. I'm going to skip this. The interesting thing is that in recent years, because of the so-called pediatric bipolar debate, and I will come to that and talk briefly about it, people became very worried that children who had irritability, were irritable, particularly irritable, had bipolar, were labeled as being bipolar, particularly in America. Long story. The bottom line is, one of the ways that the Americans thought that they could ward off this danger was by creating a new category, which is called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. People will have heard of it? DMDD? Yeah. Now, the interesting thing is that people in America started diagnosing DMDD, but they still treat that with risperidone and aripiprazole primarily. And the prescription rates, if anything, have gone up further. So, just saying, but if you hear about disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, it's essentially an irritability-based disorder, right? So a thing that you might not expect is that if you go to child clinics, irritability is a very frequent, with its various names, rages, anger, whatever, outbursts, is one of the most common reasons for referral, right? It's not operationalized usually as a diagnosis, but people will say, yeah, can you see this child that has anger problems, you know, behavior problems with outbursts? And if someone did a study and used this top problems approach that John Weiss from Harvard had devised, but you know, what is your biggest problem? And both parents and young people in child and adolescent mental health clinics present the most common reason for presenting that as a top problem is irritability. You know, I have this problem with my child, it's irritability. Now, it obviously depends on what kind of clinic you run. This was a generic clinic. You know, if you're running a different clinic, it may be different, but it's a transdiagnostic problem. Whatever transdiagnostic means, it means, in this instance, the way I use it is, the underlying diagnosis or diagnoses may be variable, but anger is the problem that is most difficult for the parents. That doesn't mean that the anger itself is at the root of the problems, right? It could be the ADHD, it could be something else that is the reason, it could be family structure, it could be all sorts of things, but that's what people see, right? And that's what comes to us. Okay, briefly, we have done several longitudinal studies about, you know, what irritability is related to. Longitudinally, it's pretty strongly associated with depression, even 20 years later. And it is genetically related in twin studies with depression. And the degree of the phenotypic overlap between irritability and depression is explained primarily by genetics. Now, I hasten to say here that the genetics you get from twin studies typically don't differentiate between interplay between pure genetics and interplay of genetic risks with the environment, like gene-environment correlations, for example. Gene-environment correlations are the phenomena that I was talking to you about before. Genetic characteristics that, for example, evoke responses in the environment. It's associated with double the risk for suicidality, even up to 30 years later, and impairment and reduced income at 20-year follow-up. So I'm going to show you some other data here from the most recent, from some analysis from the most recent Office for National Statistics data that we got hold of. Typically, people will think of irritability as being a boy's problem, right? Kind of angry boys sort of thing. And we just wanted to test this and generally want to look at what happens during development, what happens during adolescence. And what we found was the following. Whoops. Stuck again. Apologies to people online. I might. So these are the 2017 ONS data. They allowed us to access them a few years later. a kind of random probability sample of 18,000 children. We have the data from about 7,000 parents of 5 to 17-year-olds and about 3,000 from young people 11 and above, right? So that's what I'm going to be presenting to you now. And there are questions about irritable mood and temper outbursts, right, in there. So what you will find is that if you look at the percentages of irritable mood as reported by parents across development, you'll see that boys, which are red here, counterintuitively perhaps, are much higher than boys during childhood, but the two converge in adolescence, right? So this is the picture if you ask parents, and the same is true if you ask them about temper outbursts. So the notion that it's a boy's problem, right, seems to be substantiated by these data. But now, if you look at what girls report versus boys self-report, they find that they are much more irritable. These are data now from 11 to 18-year-olds, right? Because you can't ask 7-year-olds about that very easily, right? So what you see is that and this is borne out by the you know, well, obviously you can intuit this because of the standard errors that I've drawn around them, but the models work as well in the sense that girls are much higher in irritability by self-report during adolescence than are boys. They don't differ much in terms of self-reported temper outbursts, which are generally rarer at this age group. Does that make sense? Now you might say, well, but you know, the report irritable mood, but how impairing is it? Well, it is pretty impairing in the sense that, as you can see here, this is again parent report, and its presence of irritability, yes or no. And you can see that when it is present, for both boys and girls, you have a lot of impairment. When you do the same thing for self-report in adolescence, the impairment associated with irritability in girls is higher than that of boys. So it's not some sort of trivial irritability. You might say that this is because of shared method variance, because they report on themselves and all that. But actually, we did the same thing with impairment as reported by another informant, and the results were pretty similar. Okay, Marta, sorry.
Yeah, this time is a question. I was wondering, given that you capture puberty in the age range for adolescents, in girls, if you have data on age menarche, because I was wondering how much they influence self-perception.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very important question. I'm pretty sure that we don't have age at menarche data in the ONS. There are other data sets to look at. It's obviously very important, as it is a contentious question, because as we know, age at menarche is related to depression, and maybe in a kind of U-shaped fashion. So very early and very late menarche is associated with depression, particularly very early menarche. So it would be a very interesting question, but I don't think we have the data here to do that, unfortunately. But we could look in other data sets, potentially in the ABCD soon, and in the Great Smoky Mountain data. Yeah, it's a good point. Okay, so I showed you this. I just remember this before you go to your patients with preconceived notions, and ask, obviously, young people about and their parents about children about irritability, but then please make sure to also inquire with your adolescents, with your adolescent patients about irritability, particularly with your, with both genders, and don't assume, don't make kind of social stereotyping type assumptions about who might be irritable and who might not. Obviously, you might have experienced irritability in interpersonal relationships and how corrosive it can be, right? And the interesting thing, it's corrosive because it also becomes a pattern in relationships, and leads to all sorts of difficulties. So let's go to assessment and measurement. So obviously, when you measure irritability, you ask clinical questions, short questionnaires and interviews. Your clinical questions could be, do you want to tell me about anger? Is this something that ever happens to you? What about, irritability? Do you ever lash out? Things like that. Start with open questions. They're short questionnaires. We have developed one. It's freely available. You can find it online. It's called the Affective Reactivity Index. It's 7 questions. You can use it with young people where it's been primarily validated. It's pretty simple, and it's been used very widely. It's been translated in, I think, 16 languages now, and it's available in Italian as well. So, but there are other ones as well, which I'm very happy to share a table that we recently created about instruments available. You will want to ask about the intensity of the anger responses, like how bad are the temper outbursts. compared to previously, compared to others. The frequency, the duration, as I was saying before, in certain neurodevelopmental conditions, you'll find that they are particularly prolonged. You need to ask the parents very often how they feel after a temper outburst. I don't know how many of you are parents or look after children or carers, and how demanding it can be on your own resources if a child throws a tantrum, even a normative tantrum, and what emotional resources get drained. Like, how likely are you to lash out yourself? I'll come to that in more detail, but what happens if you lash out? Sorry? Well, initially, that's the thing. Initially, it doesn't get worse. But you're right, it is bad in the long run, right? You may lash out and it has some utility because you bully the child back, essentially, right? And the child may reinforce you by going quiet. But there are two bad things happening there, right? And we'll come back to them in a minute. So, continue with measurement, context and antecedents. This is hugely important as you lay out your treatment plan as well, because it may be, sometimes things are very simple. Anytime you change plans with your child that has autism, right, you create difficulties. Every time you ask someone with OCD not to wash their hands, you create difficulties. Every time you ask a socially anxious person to go to a party and, socialize, you might get an angry response. So just do your ABCs, right? Your antecedents, behaviors, consequences, sort of thing. Right? And how is irritability rewarded, which is what I was alluding to right now, and I'll come back again. Obviously, the more intense, the more easily elicited, the more progressive, the more pervasive, and the more persistent, the worse the tantrum. That's kind of, common sense, I guess. Don't worry too much about this. I'll try to explain this, because it's a bit complicated, and some people are sitting too far away. As I told you, there was a time in America when, and I don't have this slide here, but you have to imagine that there was a time in America when the diagnosis of bipolar disorder in prepubertal children went up by about, I think, 400% or something like that. That's if you look at admissions, if you look at diagnosis in insurance, claims and things like that. It was pretty extraordinary. There's some data that in Kentucky, apparently, I think something like, I have written this, so you can find it, I've commented on this. I don't want to exaggerate, but something like 7 or 8% of 5-year-olds were on an antipsychotic, with the most common diagnosis being pediatric bipolar disorder. It led to congressional inquiries because children died whilst being on a combo of antipsychotics like risperidone plus olanzapine, some things that I think Professor Taylor would, when we were training, was advising us against doing, but were commonly done, plus sodium valproate, and some had cardiac arrests. That led to congressional inquiries. It was a big hoo-ha. Anyway, we were in the camp in Britain of saying, okay, guys, are you sure about this? And when we looked back at what was happening, was some very influential groups in America said, early onset irritability is mania. It's latent, it's mania you hadn't discovered. And irritability is part of bipolar disorder, isn't it? We all know that. Why don't you diagnose it? So you will see some papers out of Harvard where there's a diagnosis of mania based on the idea that the child has been irritable since birth. Now, if you work with children, you'll know that there are parents who will tell you, he's always been like this. He's like his father, or like his mother, whatever, right? Right, very irritable. Now, you diagnose this, as mania. That was the mania. There was no elation, it was that, right? Now, what happened was that chronic irritability, temperamental irritability of the type that you saw before in the Maasai, those children in the Maasai or children in our societies, was being increasingly labeled as pediatric bipolar disorder. Now, it wasn't, I'm not suggesting these are some mean people. There were all sorts of kind of anthropological and social factors that played a role in this, including what you can claim in America. with your insurance, and including what treatments are available. Because of course, as I will show you, of course you can give risperidone to a 5-year-old and they will quieten down. I mean, of course it's going to be very efficacious, right? I mean, yeah, give a depot. You know, but is that, you know, does it therefore have mania, and is it right to do that? That's obviously a different question. So, in my opinion, and there are other people here who are better than I am to say this, but if you don't see episodic changes in behavior, episodic manic symptoms, you shouldn't be diagnosing bipolar, at least not lightheartedly. Someone tells you, well, I'm always irritable, and I'm always elated. Yeah, you may always be very excited and exuberant, but have you ever seen a manic episode that's lasted for 3 years? Right? It can't be right. So the same is with children. See whether there is a change within individuals, right? That's very important. And it should be fairly circumscribed. There are people who are hyperthymic, obviously, and Jules Angst has written a lot about that, and I believe it, but I don't think that that's kind of what you want to be treating. Yeah. No, 5 minutes. Oh, my God. Okay. But did you take into account the bit that I was talking about, the Sicilian Vespers? That doesn't count. All right, so treatment basics. Okay, this is, we can go into a lot of detail, but if you want to, the take-home message is the following. When you're faced with irritability, just try to see what else is going on, because there are other things there that are very treatable. For example, ADHD. I said this yesterday. If there is ADHD, you know, sometimes just treating it with stimulants, if you were going to treat the ADHD, just does the job. And we've got papers to show this. You know, we've got secondary analyses for this that suggest this is true. In many cases, when you have this thing called oppositional defiant disorder, which is one of the most common disorders of childhood, basically, you know, difficult children, essentially, a parenting intervention helps. So what is a parenting intervention? It is basic things like, well, if you shout back at your child, yeah, it may work in that moment, but you do 2 things. I'm going back to what I was saying. A, you model a certain type of behavior, right? You model it, so it's much more likely to happen again, probably. Secondly, you are rewarding with a lot of attention something which is negative. So one of the first things you learn as a parent is to say, oh, what a nice picture you drew there, right? You know, focus on the positive, attend to the positive, rather than, as most of us would do, say, oh, great, yeah, great, thank you, yeah, I just got to write this grant now. And when they spill something, you're like, well, how could you do this? You know, which is rewarding, of course, the bad behavior with attention. You know, oh, okay, mommy and daddy are going to turn around only when I do something. This is true of all sorts of other things as well. When you're leading a team, when you're in a relationship, you know, this is very important. How many times did you say to the person you love, well, that's so nice what you did, as opposed to, oh, yet again, you're late, you know, that sort of thing. So this is very important, right? Just because, you know, our emotions are rewarding in their own right, in the way we throw them at others. So principles like that, plus not attending to the negative, right, or attending in a very particular way, or punishing with measure, right? Punishment that should be contingent upon the action, should be proportionate to the action, not over-responding. Some very basic things that you learn. And they have effect sizes that are pretty convincing. With blind raters, effect sizes of about 0.5, 0.6, so pretty respectable. So in my opinion, you should consider them as the first line. You should consider them as the first line. So that's the first thing to do in most instances, even as the kind of basics that you do with parents and with any other patient and their relatives. We have shown in a small trial that if you have children with ADHD who have a lot of irritability, if you give them methylphenidate, they get better. A lot of them, the children get better. You could add citalopram on top of this, and you would get some more people better as well. It's not a huge amount, right? But it's worth trying if you've done the other bits. Obviously, in autism, there have been the big trials with risperidone and aripiprazole, right? And sometimes, when a child has those 2 or 3 hour tantrums, right, and the parents, you will give that. But it's not something that you give for the rest of someone's life. You don't say to a child who's 8 or 9, well, here you are, take 6 milligrams of risperidone for the next, you know, 30 years for obvious reasons, right? So these are trials that are usually kind of 8 or 12 week long, right? And you do this and you try to affect change through other routes as well, right? You monitor that very carefully and you're being just very thoughtful about it. I'm sure most of you will be. As I said, I would not do this before I have tried a parenting intervention unless it is really acute. A child is really being taken to the police station, or something horrible is happening. You will see that there are meta-analyses that say that antipsychotics work fantastically well. Well, yes, they do, but as what? What exactly is being treated there, right? Is it mainly the sedation that they cause? So you need to be wondering about this, and you will have seen that the prescription rates of antipsychotics in children have gone up quite dramatically, particularly in America. I told you about Kentucky, and other southern states are similar, right? And they have been going up in other countries as well. And this is mainly because of those, what we do with autism. And autism has become broader. So more and more children are being diagnosed with autism. Okay. So think about the societal implications of that. Yeah, anyway, I'll stop here because I think my 5 minutes are over, but I'm very happy to take questions. Yes.
Otherwise, we get online complaints.
Do you have any tips for differentiating emotional dysregulation from ADHD versus PTSD versus borderline personality?
That's a tough one. Well, with borderline, we say that it typically occurs in interpersonal contexts that are very particular, right? So that's what we say. Interestingly, we're diving into the data right now. It's not the experimental data on that is not that fantastic. Plus, very often, or quite often, girls who have been labeled as having borderline have both PTSD and ADHD. So I can't quite tell you how to differentiate that, except that I know that sometimes a formulation that is trauma-focused helps quite a lot, because trauma-focused CBT can have some effects on the emotion dysregulation that you might not otherwise achieve. Plus, giving stimulants for the ADHD could be helpful. So I don't know how to differentiate them. Now, in ADHD in an 8-year-old, the context of the outburst is very different to a 15-year-old, with a boyfriend or girlfriend, the usual kind of stuff that you would see, that you would see. Obviously, in ADHD, you often have, you have much less of this kind of self-harm, the self-harm association, although suicides in children under 13 are much more common in ADHD. So a big risk factor for early suicide is ADHD. So it's not like is not associated with aggression. Obviously, in absolute numbers, it's pretty low, as you might imagine, right? These are CDC data. Yeah. Yeah, so I don't have an answer for that, except to say the obvious, the interpersonal context, yeah. Yeah, so Dr. Gupta, who's online, asked what the rationale was for considering DMDD as a mood disorder. So this is an interesting question. I did attend a couple of the DSM-5 meetings back then. I've written about the experience actually, but I wasn't, I didn't devise it, or I wasn't the person who kind of did this. I wasn't sitting on the actual committee. So I can't tell you for sure. But what I can tell you is that if you think of irritability as a mood, as we do, and we have done for years, right? One of the symptoms of depression in children is irritability. Irritability is, for example, episodic, a symptom of mania. Then a disorder that is concerned with individual differences in irritability ought to be a mood disorder, as opposed to something that is grouped together with conduct problems, which is what it used to be and still is under oppositionality. So the irritable mood used to be considered under, well, you're being an oppositional child. And so it is now being considered as an emotional or mood problem. So that would be my answer. I don't know whether that's, whether there's a follow-up by Dr. Gupta, but thank you for the question.
2 more questions.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to be annoying and kind of ask the same question that I asked yesterday. So I have a daughter with ADHD, and I haven't had a day without a personal injury when I've been with her. And I notice on here there's nothing related to food, and I've been trying to find quite a lot of information out about that, and I just wondered if you had anything to say on that.
Sure. It's a very good question, and actually there is some evidence, and you might recall that there was a Lancet paper led by Jan Beutler a few years back now that suggested that foods might play a role, but that it's not general, it's specific to the child, it seems, right? So that you'd have to figure it out. It doesn't account for a huge proportion of the variance. But there may be particular kind of sensitivities, but it's not like, you know, what parents say, the sugar rush. You're not going to have another ice cream, right? It's not as simple as that. There have been some trials recently by some, I think these are, it's an Australia or Kiwi group, a New Zealand group, looking at micronutrients and emotion dysregulation, and some of them have some signal, so it's worth looking back at them as well. So there is some evidence that they might play a role. I suspect that it's not huge typically. So as I said, what I would do is I would do the proper sequence of doing the treatment of ADHD, if the ADHD is important, and perhaps even before then or with it, certainly after it, if it remains a problem, do a parenting intervention. And just to explain, parenting intervention doesn't mean that you're a bad parent and you need some training. It means that it is very hard to raise children, care for them. And anyone who's just sat with a child for sufficiently long will know that. So getting some help with that could be helpful, right? Particularly in societies where, for good or for worse, right, the expectations on children sitting still are growing. There used to be a very big difference between Greece and England and Italy and England in terms of what children are allowed to do at a restaurant, at a tavern. You could take your children with you in Greece and Italy, right? And they could just roam around, and it was absolutely normal, right? No one would complain. That wouldn't be the case in Britain. Now, Britain has become more like Italy in terms of coffee, you know, what you do, and maybe it's going the other way around as well. So these things play a role, societal expectations play a role, and the parenting interventions happen within that context, right? That's my general kind of thing, but yeah, we can talk more about that in the break if you like. Yeah, I'm very interested.
Thank you.
Hi, just one thing I was wondering what your opinion on was, I suppose one thing I'm seeing a bit more is young people being prescribed methylphenidate, in particular Concerta, for conduct behaviours, say aggression and violence, but off-label, say maybe instead of risperidone, irrespective of an ADHD diagnosis. But just given that it has similar evidence to risperidone in terms of managing aggression and violent behaviour, do you think that's like a positive trend? Is that a good thing that it's being used in place of risperidone, maybe keeping more children off antipsychotics, or what do you think of that trend?
I didn't realise that this was a trend. I didn't realise that this was a trend. In the absence of ADHD symptoms, I don't think there's evidence to support this, though one could do a trial. It might be sensible to do a trial. So I didn't know about it. I don't think it has evidence at the moment. I don't quite see why it would work. Well, maybe it would in the sense that you could boost people's attention, right, with methylphenidate and stimulants in general. So maybe it has a beneficial effect on aggression regardless. In fact, we want to do a trial of that sort, an experimental medicine trial of that sort. So it might be an interesting thing to do. I would wonder about the effect size of that. I wouldn't recommend it in general. It doesn't. Yeah, I don't think so. I'm not aware of evidence for it right now. People use stimulants in particular and other drugs in strategic ways. If you look at the patterns of prescription in America, there's some very interesting ecological data. They are not in the pockets where you would expect the highest prevalence of ADHD. They're in areas where school expectations are different and where there are special dispensations for diagnosis of ADHD. So there's a fantastic book on that by an economist and a psychologist. Very interesting to look at the patterns of data. And people want this diagnosis, and of course, stimulants are cognitive enhancers to an extent, right? So we know that people take them before exams, for example. fighter pilots used to take them, or take cocaine, right, which is, does a similar job. Yeah.
Thank you, Argyris. Sorry, we can't provide a question. Okay, maybe we can answer to him online because we're really running out of time. And Argyris, thank you very much. And